Hi there, I'm Jen, this is Remembered Reads, and this is going to be a wrap-up of my past couple of weeks of reading. The first thing that I picked up after my last wrap-up was An Inheritance of Ashes by Leigh Bobbitt. When you first start reading this, it looks like it's taking the direction of being a dark fantasy, and it eventually turns out to be a standard dystopia instead. It plays with the idea of an invented fantasy-type god, a cult that's led by humans. We eventually find out this is actually set in a United States after there's been some kind of calamity. There are a lot of interesting elements to this. You have former soldiers trying to go back to their lives. You have the main character is a 16-year-old who, along with her older sister, had inherited a plot of land from their father, and there had been local politicians trying to steal their land. So there are quite a few interesting social issues that it's playing with alongside these fantasy and dystopic elements, but there's never enough attention to any one thing, and there's never enough action to make up for the fact that that commentary isn't happening. So it almost was trying to do too much, I think, and as a result, none of it was particularly satisfying. I happened to finish that book in the middle of waiting at the car place while I was having the oil changed in my car. So I started scanning the available now things on Overdrive, and I picked up DNA and Social Networking, a guide to genealogy in the 21st century, which I was kind of curious about because it just so happened that over the past month, a number of friends and relatives have done DNA tests, both for genealogy and just personal curiosity reasons. This book is very focused on a British audience who are looking to do very specific family tree work. So I think outside of a British context and people who have deep roots in the UK, so for example, if you were Canadian or Australian or something and your family was recently arrived from the UK, this might also be useful. But for the most part, I was reading this more out of interest than for anything else because I am not British, so this is not super useful for me. What was interesting for me to read, I guess more personally than out of curiosity, was some of the DNA testing chapters, because even just in the 2 years since this was published, a lot of that has been refined. Not to the extent that I think people would like. I don't know how they're doing it in other countries, but in the United States, the DNA testing company 23andMe has been heavily advertising this Root for Your Roots World Cup campaign, which I guess because the US doesn't have a team in the World Cup finals, they're encouraging people to take DNA tests to find out if they might have roots somewhere else, which I think is a little silly because I think most of these DNA tests that are run by these companies are not really aimed at that. I know people use it for that, and I definitely have fallen down the pit of watching people do their DNA reveals on YouTube, especially if they are either adopted or they're somebody who's been in a country like the United States for a really long time and they no longer know where their ancestors came from, or if they're Afro-Caribbean or African-American and that information was taken from their ancestors a long time ago, so they don't know which countries they were from. So that's always fun to watch. But I think if you know where your family is from, it's not as satisfying because it's not really looking at that. My sister had given both me and my brother-in-law the Ancestry DNA kits, I think because they were A, on sale, and B, because their daycare provider told her that she had always thought that she and her husband were brother and sister and not husband and wife, and she kind of freaked out and went, what if we're related? I thought that was a little silly because my brother-in-law's family has been in Canada for several generations, whereas we're first generation, so clearly we're not close cousins even if we're related. And which, I mean, theoretically is possible because my brother-in-law's heritage is from France, Croatia, and Bosnia, and ours is from Belgium, Germany, and Turkey. And I mean, obviously, if you know your history, if it were 1796, Belgium was part of France, and obviously Bosnia and Croatia were part of the Ottoman Empire. But still, we're obviously not close cousins. In any case, the results show that we're not related to my brother-in-law, so no worries. But I did think it was funny in terms of we know where we're from. And I think people see these and they read off every country that's on there, and I don't think it's meant that way because, I mean, when I got these ancestry results, there's basically a circle over all of Western Europe, a circle over Scandinavia, and a circle over Great Britain, which if you put that on a map, that could also be a map of European countries where Germanic languages are spoken natively, plus France, because that gets lumped into Western Europe too. And then I also got a bunch of circles over the Balkans, the Caucasus, the Middle East, which if you put that on a map, that's the Ottoman Empire. None of that is surprising. And then, you know, little bits and pieces of, what was it, Central Asia, Siberia, Iberian Peninsula, which, you know, logically, if you're from anything on a trade route, that's going to happen. The Siberian is a little exciting until you read that their Siberian populations that they tested were Yakut. And Yakut people look North Asian or Inuit, sort of, but their language is Turkic, so obviously once upon a time everybody was in Central Asia and, you know, moved from there. So it's not really, you know, this is where you're from. It's more, this is the populations you share DNA with. Although, I will say, if you've done any of these tests, you can download your raw data and you can enter them on GED Match, which is more academically focused, and in terms of percentages tends to focus on ancient DNA or more general regional markers, which I think is more accurate. But then I looked at their Oracle piece, which tells you which of their reference populations you match to, and I thought that was really fascinating. When I look at a dual population, it did say Belgians, Turks. I went, okay. And in ones where they don't have reference populations in Belgium or in Turkey, I ended up getting Kent in England, which I thought was funny because my grandparents had a condo in Ostend. There's a ferry there, and one of the deals is you can take the ferry and then along with that you get a bus trip to Kent. So I've been to Kent several times, and I think it's kind of funny that there's, you know, maybe DNA matching between them because that's a regular trade route and has been for a really long time. And in addition to that, areas of Russia, the Azeri or Azerbaijani parts of Russia, which I thought was interesting. Which is not saying that I think I'm English or Azerbaijani, just that it's interesting how the gene sharing goes. Anyway, the book is not actually really about that, so that was a whole side thing. I don't know where I went with all of that. Okay, in any case, after that, I read Extraordinary Bodies by Rosemarie Garland Thompson. The subheading on this one is Figuring Physical Disability in American Culture and Literature. This is a book that was written originally in the 90s and was recently re-released. It is basically literary criticism / analysis. It looks at, for example, there's a chapter that's images of disability in Toni Morrison's writing. There is a chapter on the history of freak shows and how that has been written about, things like that. It's very dry and academic in tone, but if you are interested in this, and I think I have read this before, but not recently, so it was interesting to go through it again. It did feel probably more dry since I was rereading it. I do think it's worth reading, and I've said this about a couple of things that I've read recently, in that this is one of these things that I think was more interesting when there wasn't such a widely recognized field in terms of critical disability studies, but it was still interesting to look at. After that, on a completely different theme, I picked up Wildstorm Volume 2. This is again, the Wildstorm reboot that's written by Warren Ellis and drawn by John Davis Hunt. I had loved Volume 1. I was worried that I wasn't going to love it as much as it continued, but it continues to be top quality. This is exactly what I would want in a reinvention of the Wildstorm universe. This one brings in some more of the Authority characters. We get to see Jack Hawksmoor as kind of a hobo wandering around. There were some interesting bits where Jenny Sparks and Jenny Quantum are one character now, basically, and Shen Li Min and the Doctor are one character now, which I thought was really interesting. There are some great action scenes, some great introductions to the characters. The art is solid. I continue to be really impressed with that. I really like the way that that plays with both superhero books and specifically changes the way the kind of bright colors that you expect of the Wildstorm of the 90s. So yeah, I'm still really enjoying that one. On a more serious comics note, I followed that up by reading Amy Kurzweil's Flying Couch, a graphic memoir. This is both a memoir of her own life as well as being a memoir of how her grandmother survived the Holocaust. Unfortunately, the two don't really merge together in a way that you would expect of a story like that, and I think it's hard to do a story like this because it covers a lot of the same ground of, I think, what we think of as one of the greatest graphic memoirs of all time, which is obviously Maus. And I mean, in this, she actually has visions at one point that include a number of famous Jewish people in history, as well as a number of famous cartoonists and art Spiegelman is actually one of the ghosts that haunt her, sort of. That's, I don't know how else to phrase that. This was okay. I wasn't a huge fan. I don't particularly like the art style. It is very simple and almost simplistic, I would say. So that turned me off a bit. I think it's a little unfair to judge something like this against the greats of the medium, but at the same time, it's difficult not to. It was fine, but I was overall kind of disappointed in it. I didn't think it... The grandmother's story is interesting, and it's told in the grandmother's voice and in the grandmother's accent, which is an interesting choice in pieces, but it never really worked as a whole piece for me, so. Oh, and then finally I read John Boyne's Stay Where You Are and Then Leave. I had not been a fan of John Boyne's The Absolutist, which is a First World War novel aimed at an adult audience. This is a First World War novel aimed at a young audience. The main character in this is 9 years old and is a kid who has started shining shoes to help support his mother. His father is in a shell shock hospital, and it deals with a lot of heavy issues through the eyes of this child. The child narrator didn't 100% work for me. I thought for a lot of the things he was doing, it would have made a lot more sense if he were even just a year older, because at 10 or 11, I completely believe all of the things that he does in here. At 9, I don't know. On the other hand, I think if you read this and you were 8 years old, I think this would be great. I think this would really catch you. And a lot of the silliness of, oh, he has a random encounter with the Prime Minister, which you read that as an adult and it's silly, but I think for a kid that would be engaging. So I did think this was probably very successful for the target audience, and I was charmed reading it as an adult as well. I like that each of the chapter names comes from a song of the era. I thought that was a fun way of getting you in the mood for this. So yeah, this was significantly more successful for me than I thought The Absolutist was, and I'd been putting off picking up The Heart's Invisible Furies, which a lot of people, both in my real life and on BookTube, have raved about, because I did dislike The Absolutist so much, but having been charmed by this as I was, I might be more willing to revisit some more of Boyne's writing. So I guess that was a success. In any case, that's been my week. I didn't really have any focuses on any particular genre of anything, so this was, yeah, interesting. I hope you've had a good week, and that's it for now. Ciao.